The morning sun filtered through pale curtains, drawing faint golden stripes across the floor of Jake Carter's new living room. The scent of unpacked cardboard still lingered in the air, that blend of dust, tape, and new beginnings. He'd moved into Oak Ridge Meadows barely 2 weeks ago, looking forward to quiet nights, trimmed lawns, and a break from the chaos of city policing. The neighborhood had a peaceful rhythm to it, kids pedaling bikes, sprinklers whispering across lawns, dogs barking in distant yards. It felt like the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. At least, that's what Jake thought. He had worked late the previous night, running through paperwork at the precinct. When he pulled into his driveway that morning, coffee in hand, something immediately felt off. The side gate that always clicked shut behind him was slightly ajar. It was a small detail, barely noticeable, but to someone with his training, it shouted louder than words. Jake's instincts sharpened, that quiet hum of awareness that never really leaves a cop's mind. He took a slow breath, scanning the yard. The grass looked normal, the flower beds untouched, but there was a faint muddy trail near the steps leading to the back door. Inside, the house was still. Too still. He nudged the door open, his hand hovering near his concealed carry, not drawing it yet, just ready. The faint scent of lavender air freshener mixed with something else, a trace of perfume that wasn't his. He stepped inside, eyes moving across the living room. The rug was slightly crooked, and a cushion on the couch was flipped upside down. At first, he thought maybe it was the movers, or maybe he'd just forgotten to tidy up. But then he saw it, faint footprints, dried mud from shoes that definitely weren't his. They led from the back door to his kitchen counter, and there, sitting neatly between his unopened mail, was a copy of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA bylaws. A red pen circled one paragraph aggressively. Residents must maintain uniform exterior standards and seek approval for non-conforming structures or vehicles. Jake stared at it in silence. He didn't even own any non-conforming structures. His unmarked police SUV, dark gray, low profile, was parked neatly in his driveway. It was registered, insured, and within every community rule he'd read. So why the underlined non-conforming? Why the muddy prints inside his home? He picked up the paper and turned it over, faint fingerprints smudged across the corner, and the ink of the red pen still a little wet. That meant whoever left it had been here very recently. A wave of irritation rose in him, but years of police work had trained him to control it. Emotion clouded observation. He methodically checked each room. Bedroom, untouched. Closet, fine. Bathroom, nothing out of place. But when he got to his office, a small space by the window where his old badge and framed commendations hung, he noticed the blinds had been lifted. Whoever entered had looked outside, maybe taking notes or pictures. Jake ran his finger along the windowsill. Fresh dust lines were broken. Someone had stood there, leaning forward. He knew one person who had already shown a little too much interest in his affairs. Margaret Hensley, the neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer, or as most of the neighbors called her, Karen. She was the HOA president, and during the welcome barbecue last weekend, she had interrogated him about his work vehicle, his fence height, and even the shade of gray he'd chosen for his shutters. He had laughed it off at first, thinking she was just overly enthusiastic about neighborhood rules. But now, looking at the footprints and that circled clause, he felt the faint buzz of a violation, not on paper, but of privacy. He opened his laptop and checked the small security camera feed he'd set up outside the garage. It was only a cheap motion sensor cam for packages, not meant for surveillance. Still, he rewound the footage from the last 24 hours. Nothing out front. Then, a flicker on the side feed, around 3:20 p.m. the previous day, a figure in a pale jacket slipping through the side gate. The video was grainy, but the frame caught just enough light to reveal a familiar face. Short blonde hair, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard. Karen. She had actually walked into his backyard. Jake leaned back in disbelief, his jaw tightening. Entering private property without consent wasn't just a bold move, it was trespassing. He paused the footage, the frame frozen on her halfway through his yard, head tilted like she was inspecting something. What was she thinking? That she had authority to invade someone's home in the name of compliance? The thought simmered in his mind, disbelief mixing with frustration. He closed the laptop and took a deep breath. He didn't want to start a scene or escalate things publicly. It was a quiet neighborhood, and he'd seen enough confrontations in his career to know they rarely ended well. But there were lines, legal, moral, and personal, and Margaret had just crossed all three. He decided he'd give her the benefit of the doubt for now. Maybe she'd just wandered too far while taking photos of property lines or lawn edges. Maybe she hadn't realized what she'd done. Still, something told him this wasn't an accident. As he made himself another cup of coffee, Jake's mind played through the next steps. His instincts said to report it immediately. His patience said to wait, observe, and let her dig her own hole deeper. He'd met dozens of people like Karen, the kind who wore authority like armor but didn't actually understand the weight of real law. They thrived on control, on being seen as the one in charge. And the moment someone challenged that illusion, they doubled down. Standing by the window, watching kids ride bikes down the cul-de-sac, Jake decided he wouldn't confront her yet. He'd bide his time, set things up properly. A quiet smile crossed his face, the kind that meant he was already planning something. For now, he'd just document everything. If she came back, she'd be caught red-handed. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, rustling through the trees. From across the street, Karen's voice carried faintly as she chatted with another neighbor, clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge of honor. She glanced toward Jake's house, her eyes narrowing, and for a brief moment their gazes met through the window. She smiled, polite, almost sweet, and waved. Jake raised his cup of coffee in return, calm and unreadable. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And Jake? He had no intention of knocking on her door to warn her. Because the next time she stepped onto his property without consent, there would finally be a knock that came for her. The next morning came crisp and cool, sunlight crawling slowly over the rows of nearly identical homes. The cul-de-sac was waking up, sprinklers ticking in rhythmic arcs, dogs barking in fenced yards, the faint hum of lawnmowers echoing from a few blocks down. Jake Carter had just stepped out onto his porch, a mug of black coffee in hand, when he saw her. Margaret Hensley, or Karen, as most of the neighborhood had come to whisper, was marching down the sidewalk with her trademark clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Her short blonde bob bounced with every step, and her mouth was already moving before she even reached the driveway. Jake could tell by her stride that this wasn't a friendly visit. "Mr. Carter," she barked, not even waiting for a greeting. "We need to talk about that vehicle of yours." Jake exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his tone. "Morning to you too, Margaret. What about my vehicle?" She stopped at the edge of his driveway, planting her feet like she was staking a flag into enemy territory. "That SUV parked there," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. "That's not an approved color, nor an authorized model for residential display. You can't have a government or enforcement vehicle parked overnight. It violates Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the Oak Ridge Meadows regulations." Jake looked over at the SUV. It was a dark gray Ford Interceptor, completely unmarked, no decals, no sirens. It looked no different than any civilian model you'd see in a dealership lot. "It's not a government vehicle," he replied evenly. "It's my personal car. Fully registered, insured, and listed on my lease. Nothing illegal or out of compliance." Karen's lips tightened. "Don't play games with me, Mr. Carter. I know a law enforcement vehicle when I see one. We have a standard to maintain here. The HOA was founded on aesthetics, not intimidation." He couldn't help but chuckle. "Aesthetics? You think my car intimidates people?" She bristled. "Neighbors have mentioned concerns. They feel uncomfortable. You have tinted windows, reinforced bumpers, and," she checked her clipboard, "a spotlight mount near the driver's mirror. That's police-grade equipment. You're trying to skirt the rules." Jake set his coffee down on the porch railing and crossed his arms. "Margaret, are you telling me you've been inspecting my vehicle up close?" "Of course," she snapped, as if it were obvious. "I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to monitor compliance. I walked over yesterday afternoon to confirm your address and note any violations. You weren't home, but I had to verify." Jake's jaw tensed. He'd expected her to deny it, to at least feign ignorance about stepping onto his property. But she was proud of it, boasting, even. He felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "So you entered my backyard?" And my home. Her chin lifted defiantly. I stepped inside because your garage door was open, and I needed to verify your vehicle's registration number for HOA records. There's nothing wrong with that. The bylaws give me authority to inspect common areas and visible property for compliance. Jake stared at her, silent for a moment. Then he slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the camera app. Margaret, he said calmly, I'm recording this conversation for transparency. Do you understand that? Karen blinked. What? Why? For documentation, he said simply. You're admitting, on record, to entering my property without permission. Her expression flickered, a crack in her confidence, but she quickly recovered. Don't twist my words, Mr. Carter. I'm simply doing my job. This community has rules, and if you can't follow them, perhaps Oak Ridge Meadows isn't the right fit for you. Jake didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, the only sound being a bird chirping on a fence post nearby. He'd dealt with hundreds of confrontations in his career, suspects, witnesses, angry citizens, but few had the audacity of this woman. She truly believed she was untouchable, that a clipboard and a title made her above the law. Margaret, he said finally, his voice even, you don't have any legal right to enter private property, let alone someone's home. Those bylaws you keep quoting? They don't override trespassing laws. Her nostrils flared. I don't appreciate being lectured. I've been president of this association for 8 years. Everyone knows I keep this neighborhood in order. The last thing we need is some authority figure thinking he's above the community rules. Jake's lips curved into a small, patient smile. Trust me, I know a thing or two about authority. For a split second, something in his tone made her hesitate. Her eyes darted to the badge imprint on his belt, faint, just visible under his shirt, and she faltered. You're not actually... He didn't answer. Instead, he just looked at her with quiet, measured calm. The kind that unnerved people who were used to controlling every conversation. Karen shifted, trying to regain her footing. Regardless, she said stiffly, you'll be receiving a formal violation notice from the HOA by tomorrow morning. You'll have 72 hours to remove the vehicle or face daily fines. I expect compliance. She turned sharply, heels clicking against the concrete as she stormed back toward the street. But Jake noticed something interesting, the way she glanced over her shoulder, eyes flicking back to his phone still recording. The first seed of doubt had been planted. He watched her go, the corners of his mouth tightening with quiet resolve. He hadn't planned on making this personal. But now, it wasn't just about privacy, it was about principle. People like Karen thrived on intimidation, on making good people feel small under the guise of rules. That ended today. Inside, he transferred the video file to his computer, labeling it HOA_encounter_01. He opened the folder containing the previous day's footage from his side camera and saved a still frame of Karen entering his backyard. Evidence was stacking up, piece by piece, calmly, methodically. He didn't need to shout, argue, or threaten. He'd let the truth, and the law, handle the rest. That night, as the neighborhood settled under the glow of porch lights, Jake sat by his window, watching. Across the street, he could see Karen's silhouette through her blinds, pacing her living room, probably drafting another notice or complaint. The sight almost made him laugh. He wasn't angry anymore, just determined. He pulled out his notebook, jotting down a few details. Date, June 12th. Time, 8:43 a.m., verbal confrontation. HOA president admitted to property entry. Recorded evidence secured. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added one more line. Next step, observe. Document. Prepare the warrant. Because while Karen was still busy writing violation slips, Jake was preparing something far more official and far more permanent. Tomorrow, he'd set the trap. For the next few days, Oak Ridge Meadows felt deceptively quiet. The air carried that early summer stillness where the heat lingered long after sunset, and neighbors waved politely while watering their lawns, unaware of the silent storm building behind one man's calm gaze. Jake Carter spent those days in deliberate patience. Every morning he went about his routine, jogging at dawn, greeting the mailman, tinkering with his truck in the driveway, as if nothing had happened. But beneath that composed exterior, he was meticulously preparing. His first stop had been a small electronics store off the highway, where he picked up a set of discrete Wi-Fi cameras, motion-triggered, night vision, high definition. He knew exactly where to place them, one under the eaves facing the backyard, another inside the window ledge of his home office, angled toward the side gate. A third camera went inside, behind a picture frame that overlooked his living room. If Karen ever decided to step foot inside again, she'd be recorded from 3 angles before she could even set down her clipboard. Jake had learned long ago that justice isn't about impulse, it's about timing and proof. His fellow officers used to joke that he could wait out a storm longer than anyone, that his patience was what made him dangerous. He smiled at that thought as he tightened the last screw on the gate camera and synced it to his phone. The setup was complete. Now, all he needed to do was wait. By Wednesday afternoon, he didn't have to wait long. The first sign came in the form of a small white envelope wedged under his front door, a formal HOA notice. It was printed in Shop Times New Roman, with all the false authority of a government order. Vehicle violation, unauthorized exterior appearance and overnight parking. Beneath it, a signature in confident, curling ink, Margaret Hensley, HOA President. Jake read it twice, his expression unreadable. Then, he folded the paper neatly, placed it in a manila folder labeled Evidence, and returned to his coffee. He spent the rest of the day reviewing his camera feeds, testing the motion alerts. He even adjusted his schedule to make sure he wouldn't be home during the hours Margaret usually did her rounds. It wasn't hard to predict. She was a creature of habit, parading around the neighborhood every Thursday between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. Clipboard in hand, always on the hunt for nonconformity. Thursday came with a heavy sky, gray clouds threatening rain. Jake parked his SUV in the driveway like always, locked up the house, and drove off to a coffee shop downtown. From his booth seat near the window, he opened his phone's security app and waited. The feed flickered live, empty drive, quiet lawn. 2 p.m. passed. Nothing. 2:30. A leaf fluttered across the gate, triggering a false motion alert. He smiled faintly. Then, at 3:07, the screen lit up with a familiar figure. Margaret had arrived. Even through the grainy camera, her posture screamed authority, chin high, clipboard against her chest like a shield. She paused at the edge of the driveway, looking left and right before unhooking the side gate latch. Jake's jaw tightened. She hesitated only a second before slipping inside, her white sneakers making no sound on the stone path. She moved slowly, scanning, inspecting, every motion deliberate, rehearsed. He watched as she took out her phone and began snapping photos of his SUV, zooming in on the license plate, the rear bumper, even the small LED spotlight mount. Then she glanced toward the house itself. The camera caught her stepping closer, her expression hardening as she peered through the living room window. Jake's thumb hovered over the record button, though the feed was already saving automatically. Margaret muttered something, too faint to hear, before trying the back door handle. When it didn't open, she circled around, disappearing briefly from the view of one camera, only to reappear inside the living room feed a few seconds later. She'd found an unlocked side door. There she was, standing in his home again. This time with crystal clarity. Jake's heartbeat stayed steady, his training kicking in. He took a screenshot, time-stamped, watermarked, then switched to the front yard camera. She hadn't come alone this time. Her silver sedan sat parked across the street, hazard lights blinking faintly in the drizzle. That meant intent. Premeditation. She wasn't inspecting. She was trespassing. He made the call. "Dispatch, this is Detective Carter, badge 7145, he said quietly, keeping his tone measured. "I've got an active trespass at my residence in Oak Ridge Meadows. Suspect identified as Margaret Hensley, female, late 50s, currently inside the property without consent. Cameras recording. Requesting units for a non-emergency apprehension." "Copy that, Detective," came the calm reply. "Units en route. ETA 6 minutes. Maintain visual." Jake ended the call and exhaled, still watching. Karen had moved deeper into the living room, inspecting his walls as if she were assessing interior paint. At one point, she lifted a framed photo from the mantel, a picture of Jake in uniform beside his late father, also a cop, and shook her head disapprovingly before setting it down. That image would burn into his memory, the moment arrogance crossed into desecration. The rain began to fall harder, tapping against the window. Jake's phone buzzed. The cruiser had arrived. Through the front camera feed, flashing blue and red lights reflected against the wet pavement. Karen's head snapped toward the noise. She froze, clipboard clutched tight, confusion flashing across her face as two uniformed officers approached the porch. One knocked firmly on the door while the other announced their presence. "Police department, ma'am." "Step outside." Margaret appeared at the window, disbelief plastered across her features. She hesitated, then cracked the door open an inch. "Officers, there must be some misunderstanding." "Step outside," one repeated firmly. Jake watched from his phone as she finally emerged, Rain spotting her floral blouse. Her eyes darted from the officers to the patrol car, and then to the end of the street, where Jake's unmarked sedan was pulling up. He stepped out slowly, the familiar weight of his badge and sidearm grounding him. As he approached, the scene came into sharp focus. Margaret's shocked expression, the officer's composed professionalism, the neighbors beginning to peek out their windows. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even smug. Just calm, controlled, resolute. The irony wasn't lost on him. The woman who had spent years lecturing others about community standards was now the one caught violating the most basic boundary of all. Jake nodded to the officers. "Thank you, gentlemen. I'll take it from here." They recognized him immediately and stepped aside. He stopped a few feet from Margaret, whose voice trembled between disbelief and indignation. "Detective Carter," she began, forcing a smile that wavered. "I can explain. This was a simple misunderstanding. I was conducting a property inspection." Jake tilted his head. "Inside my living room?" She swallowed hard. It looked like your garage door was open again, and I thought I saw." He raised a hand to stop her. "Margaret, you've been recorded on 3 separate cameras entering a private residence without permission. That's unlawful entry, and given the prior warning, it's criminal trespass. You're under arrest." Her eyes went wide. "You can't be serious. I'm the HOA president." "And I'm a police officer," Jake said evenly. "Which means I'm very serious." She sputtered, her words dissolving into protest as one of the officers gently took her clipboard and read her rights. The rain kept falling, soft and steady, washing the tension into the gutters. Jake turned slightly, watching the neighbors whisper from behind half-drawn curtains. Some looked shocked. Others almost relieved. 4 months, maybe years, Karen had ruled Oak Ridge Meadows through fear and fines. But in that moment, standing soaked and silent beside a patrol car, her reign ended not with applause, but with quiet, satisfied disbelief. Jake waited until the cruiser drove off before turning back toward his house. The lights flickered through the rain one last time, then disappeared around the corner. He took a deep breath, shoulders easing as the silence returned. His phone buzzed again. The cameras had automatically uploaded the footage to the cloud. Evidence secured. Case closed. He stepped onto his porch, wiping rain from his hair, and allowed himself the faintest smile. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came quietly, through patience, proof, and the perfect setup. And tonight, justice had finally arrived in Oak Ridge Meadows. Rain glazed the streets of Oak Ridge Meadows that evening, turning the sidewalks into mirrored ribbons that reflected porch lights and flashing sirens. The entire cul-de-sac seemed to have gathered at their windows, drawn by the glow of red and blue. The neighborhood, usually so precise and polite, now held its collective breath. They watched as the self-appointed queen of compliance, Margaret Hensley, stood on the curb with her floral blouse plastered to her skin, her clipboard dangling uselessly from one hand. The rain had smudged the ink on her notes until the rules she'd written for others bled into unreadable streaks. Jake Carter stepped out from under the shelter of his porch, his badge gleaming beneath the streetlights. Every step he took was deliberate, steady. The officers who had responded gave him a respectful nod as he approached, but they didn't speak. They knew this wasn't about pride or rank, it was about closure. The water pooled around his boots as he stopped a few feet from Margaret. She was trembling, though whether from cold or indignation he couldn't tell. "Margaret Hensley," he said, voice firm but measured. "You're being placed under arrest for criminal trespass and unlawful entry. You have the right to remain silent." Her composure cracked. "This is outrageous," she cried, stepping back. "You can't arrest me on my own street." I was doing my duty to this community. Jake's gaze didn't waver. Your duty ends where someone else's property begins. The younger officer moved in beside him, taking hold of her wrist with professional care, snapping the cuffs in place with a metallic click that cut through the sound of rain. The neighborhood seemed to exhale at once, a quiet, collective sigh from dozens of unseen witnesses behind drawn curtains. The woman who had once strutted through their yards, issuing fines and threats, was now standing in the same street, hands bound, mascara running like ink down a page. Margaret twisted toward Jake, desperation creeping into her tone. "Detective, please. I didn't mean to upset anyone. You left your side door open. I was just checking that everything was safe." Jake's face softened only a fraction. "You checked it twice, Margaret. Once last week, and again today. You didn't knock. You didn't call. You crossed a line you had no right to cross." "I was protecting the neighborhood," she insisted, voice rising, her words trembling with the edge of panic. "No one else has the backbone to enforce the rules." "Rules," Jake echoed quietly, "aren't the law." For a moment the only sound was the rain drumming against the patrol car roof. The irony seemed to sink in. Margaret's obsession with control had led her straight into the hands of real authority. The same clipboard that had once been her symbol of power now sat soggy and forgotten in the gutter. The officers guided her gently toward the cruiser. As they did, a few neighbors stepped out onto their porches. Mrs. Lee from next door, usually timid, crossed her arms with a small shake of her head. The Peterson twins whispered excitedly from behind their father's legs. Even old Mr. Graham, who'd once been fined for excessive mailbox height, stood under his umbrella watching in silence. No one jeered, no one clapped, they simply watched, the weight of quiet justice settling in the air. Margaret tried one last time to salvage dignity. "You're making a mistake. This will destroy the HOA. You'll regret this, detective." Jake met her eyes. "The HOA isn't the problem. It's what happens when power forgets respect." She had no reply. The cruiser door closed with a solid thud, muffling her protests. The flashing lights painted the wet pavement red and blue, then slowly faded as the car pulled away, leaving only the distant sound of rain and the faint murmur of neighbors whispering behind curtains. Jake stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. He wasn't gloating, he felt no triumph in it. Arrests like this weren't about satisfaction, they were about boundaries, the invisible ones that keep a community safe. Margaret had violated more than property, she'd violated trust. And in Oak Ridge Meadows, that mattered. He finally turned back toward his house. The porch light cast a warm halo as he stepped inside, peeling off his damp jacket. The cameras still blinked faintly from their corners, silent witnesses to the entire ordeal. He replayed one of the clips, the moment she'd entered, the moment she realized too late she'd gone too far. It would be evidence now, sealed and filed away, but to him it was more than that. It was proof that patience and discipline still mattered in a world ruled by impulse. The next morning, the rain had washed the streets clean. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, as gossip does, passed over hedges, through text messages, whispered at mailboxes. The story took on a life of its own. The HOA president arrested for trespassing, the quiet new neighbor revealed to be a cop. Some said he'd orchestrated it like a sting. Others claimed she'd been warned and ignored him. Either way, by noon, the clipboard queen of Oak Ridge Meadows had become its cautionary tale. By the end of the week, a special HOA meeting was called in the community hall. The turnout was the largest anyone could remember. Jake attended, not in uniform, but in a plain gray shirt, hands tucked into his pockets. The board members looked uneasy without their leader. After some awkward shuffling, one of them, a man named Tom Reeves, cleared his throat and announced Margaret's resignation, effective immediately. There was a pause, then spontaneous applause, not loud or mocking, just relieved. When the meeting ended, several neighbors approached Jake to thank him. One woman said quietly, "She made my husband repaint our house twice over a shade of beige." Another added, "She fined us for leaving our trash bins out for 10 minutes." Jake only nodded politely, offering small smiles, deflecting praise. He hadn't done it for recognition. He'd done it because someone had to remind them all that boundaries exist for a reason. Later that evening, he sat on his porch again, the air fresh with the smell of wet grass. Across the street, Margaret's house sat dark. The porch light was off for the first time in years. Her nameplate had already been removed from the HOA bulletin board. The street was quieter, calmer. The sense of tension that once hummed beneath every conversation seemed to have evaporated. Jake took a sip of coffee, feeling the same steady satisfaction he got after closing a long, difficult case. He wasn't sure if Margaret would serve time or just face fines, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was the message that had settled into the soil of Oak Ridge Meadows: rules are meant to guide, not to control. And respect, once lost, can't be legislated back into existence. He leaned back in his chair, watching the last light fade from the horizon. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood actually felt like home. The morning sun broke gently over Oak Ridge Meadows, painting the trimmed lawns and picket fences with a golden warmth that hadn't touched the neighborhood in a long time. For once, it felt peaceful. Gone were the morning patrols of Margaret Hensley with her clipboard in hand, measuring grass heights or snapping pictures of garbage bins. The air itself seemed lighter, free of the invisible tension she had carried through every block like a storm cloud. Now, the sounds of children playing, dogs barking, and lawnmowers humming formed a kind of suburban symphony, a melody of normalcy that had been missing for too long. Detective Jake Carter leaned against the white railing of his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the neighborhood come alive. It had been 2 weeks since the arrest, and though the news had made brief waves across the local community board, life had slowly found its rhythm again. Some called it the calm after the Karen, others just said it felt like they could finally breathe. He didn't gloat, though. To him, it wasn't a victory, it was a course correction. The neighborhood wasn't supposed to be a battleground between control and rebellion. It was supposed to be a place where people coexisted, respected, and looked out for each other. The HOA, now under temporary leadership, had started to show signs of reform. Tom Reeves, the interim president, sent around a memo with a tone that was shockingly friendly. Instead of fines and threats, it asked for community input. They held a weekend barbecue to discuss new guidelines, turning what used to be a cold bureaucratic process into a real conversation. Jake had been invited, of course, though he had been reluctant at first. But when he arrived, he saw something unexpected: laughter. People who had avoided each other for months were sitting together, swapping stories, comparing the most absurd fines they'd received under Margaret's rule. "Remember when she made me repaint my fence because it was 2 shades darker than the approved color?" One man laughed, shaking his head. "She showed up with a paint swatch at 7 a.m. "That's nothing," another neighbor said, leaning forward. "She fined me because my Halloween pumpkins decayed too slowly." Like I had control over that. The small crowd burst into laughter. For the first time, the stories weren't whispered in frustration, they were shared in relief. Margaret had once been the enforcer of order, but now her legacy had become a lesson in excess. Jake listened quietly, smiling faintly as he realized the neighborhood was healing not through punishment, but through connection. When Tom finally stood up to speak, his tone carried the humility the community had long craved. "We got too caught up in the rules," he said simply, holding a paper plate full of barbecue ribs. "We forgot the people those rules were supposed to serve. From now on, the HOA isn't going to police you, it's going to help you." The crowd applauded softly, not out of obligation, but out of genuine appreciation. Jake nodded to himself. This was what he'd hoped would happen. Margaret's downfall hadn't just removed a tyrant, it had forced everyone to look inward, to ask themselves why they'd let fear and conformity rule their daily lives. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding trust. As the weeks turned into a month, the transformation was undeniable. The community garden, once nearly shut down by Margaret over improper soil usage, was flourishing. A few teenagers had painted a mural on the old community wall, something bright and hopeful, full of color and unity. Even the HOA newsletters had changed. Instead of cold warnings, they now featured neighborhood birthdays, community projects, and shout-outs for volunteer work. Oak Ridge Meadows was becoming what it should have been all along, a community that cared, not one that controlled. Yet there were moments when Jake would catch himself glancing at Margaret's old house across the street. The "for sale" sign still swayed in the breeze. He'd heard rumors. Some said she'd moved in with her sister out of town, others claimed she was appealing the charges. But Jake didn't dwell on it. He'd done his duty. He'd drawn a line, and for once, it had made a difference beyond the courtroom. One evening, Just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Jake found a small envelope on his porch. No name, no address, just his house number scrawled in neat handwriting. He opened it cautiously. Inside was a short note that read, "Detective Carter. I wanted to say thank you. My husband and I almost moved away last year because of how bad things had gotten. We couldn't take another fine, another confrontation. But now, it feels like we have our home back. Thank you for reminding us that standing up for what's right still matters. Your neighbor, Mrs. Lee." Jake folded the note carefully and tucked it into his wallet. It was a small gesture, but to him, it meant more than any official commendation. This wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about restoring balance, about making people believe again in fairness and boundaries that protect, not punish. Later that night, the porch lights along Oak Ridge Meadows flickered on one by one, a chain of golden warmth linking every house down the street. Jake leaned back in his chair, listening to the distant sound of laughter echoing from the park. For the first time since he'd moved there, it didn't feel like a neighborhood under surveillance. It felt like a home. He thought about how fragile communities could be, how quickly power could twist something meant for good into something cruel. But he also realized something else. When people stood together, when they stopped being afraid to speak up, even the smallest streets could shine brighter than any badge. As the night settled, he smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Case closed." The camera of imagination would pull back now, away from Jake, away from the quiet street, rising higher above the roofs and lawns of Oak Ridge Meadows. Below, the neighborhood looked almost perfect again, just as it had been in the glossy brochures. But this time, the perfection wasn't an illusion. It was earned.